on Sustain. I can't speak Spanish. I'm going to stop speaking Spanish. But Sustain's the podcast where we talk about open source for the long haul. Who are we? Where did we come from? Where are we going? Why didn't I learn Spanish in high school? Excellent questions, everyone. Excellent questions. Really excited to talk to our guest today. We only have one person on the line besides me. I am Richard Littauer, your host. Hello, everyone. And I'm joined today by Federico Mena Quintero, who is calling today from Mexico, from Jalapa, the Ciudad de las Flores, the city of flowers, so called by Alexander Humboldt. Federico, how you doing?
Hi, Richard. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you on. When he put his role in my little prep doc that I send to all the participants, he just said GNOME hacker. And that was the end of the story. Federico is a lot more than a single GNOME hacker, although he does work on GNOME. He is on the board of directors. He is in the code of conduct committee for GNOME. And of course, he's also one of the founders of GNOME, a desktop environment that's used on Linux machines. So if you're using Linux and you see stuff, chances are you're looking at GNOME or the other one. Federico, how have I already messed up describing what GNOME is? Because you've been around for a bit longer than I have, and you may have a better elevator pitch.
No, it's fine. It's like there's different ways to describe it. The problem with describing GNOME is that it's mostly, but not only, a piece of infrastructure. You see it visually as the skin that your operating system presents to you, like the menu bar at the top where you can click the volume button and the Wi-Fi button and the decorations around the windows and the desktop background. Those are not apps. It's the surface of your desk. So there's a lot of infrastructure under that thing. And that's why it's so hard to describe, because nobody wants to hear about audio mixing, daemons, and video playback codecs, and yada, yada, yada.
So Linux has been around for quite a long time. How did GNOME get started? Because at some point you decided, actually, someone does need to work on the audio codecs and someone does need to make a better visualization. Can you talk me through what happened?
Yeah. Before I started college, I was in high school, of course. I had an interest in computer graphics. The movie Jurassic Park had just come out. Okay. When I saw that, I said, man, I want to do computer graphics for the rest of my life. I want to make the software that makes these dinosaurs. So I started studying a bit of graphics on my own. And by the time I started college, I had already written a couple of image processing utilities that I just used on my own. You know, there was an image processing filter to take an image. If you think of a tablecloth on top of a table and you take it from the center and twist it.
Yeah.
It makes that effect on an image. Another one to make it look like if it's printed on a rubber surface and you punch the rubber, it makes it look like that. So it's just a couple of image processing algorithms. And when I got to college, a funny thing happened. The last class of the first day was the discrete mathematics class. It was a good introductory class. My teacher presented himself, etc. And the other group in my cohort, let's say, also had the discrete math class, but with another teacher. And the first thing I hear in the hallway when I'm about to exit the classroom is somebody talking very loudly, speaking very badly about C++, the programming language, which I was learning at the time on my own.
Yeah.
And I thought that it was the greatest language ever. So I thought, oh man, somebody's talking garbage about C++. Let's see who the hell this person dares to be, right? And that's where I met Miguel de Icaza, my college friend, the other founder of GNOME. Miguel and I became friends. He was already working on fairly sophisticated stuff. He was one of the Linux kernel contributors. He was also writing software on his own. He's the author of The Midnight Commander, a very popular file manager for text consoles. Miguel saw that I already knew how to program. I could program fairly well back then. And I told him that I had these grandiose plans to make a Photoshop clone and do it as free software, because I already knew about things like the GNU project, the free software goals, ethics, all that stuff. And I wanted to do my own free clone of Photoshop. Of course, back then, I had no idea how to structure something as ambitious or as big as that. And one day, Miguel tells me, hey, Federico, you need to take a look at this software that just came out. It's free software. It's released under one of the GNU licenses. And that was the GIMP, the GNU Image Manipulation Program. It had just come out a couple of weeks before. And when I tried the very first version, I saw that it was interesting, functional, very basic. Of course, it was just the first version. And I told Miguel, this is fine, but it's not ambitious enough. No, it's not as functional as I want to make it. I don't think it's going to accommodate that sort of sophistication. And Miguel told me, don't think so small about the thing you're seeing. Just take it as an exercise to take your image processing programs and remake them as GIMP plugins, because it already supported a plugin architecture. So I said, okay, let's see what happens. So I started studying the source code for the GIMP and the GIMP's plugins. The plugins were fairly easy to write. I figured out how to do that from looking at the source code for the built-in plugins. And I ported the first of my filters, the one that takes the tablecloth and twists it. I ported it to the GIMP and I sent the source code as a text file to the GIMP's authors in an email, because back then we didn't have version control. We didn't have Git or Subversion or even CVS. Was nothing like that was being used for the GIMP. So I just sent them the source code for my filter, and I went home. And the very next day, I opened my email, which I could only do at the university. I didn't have internet access at home. There was no broadband back then, or even, I think, dial-up was just getting started in Mexico City. So I just went to the university, checked my email, and I get this reply back from the two original authors of the GIMP, who were two guys studying in the University of California in Berkeley. And they say, hey, this is fantastic. Please keep writing plugins for us. We want more. And that got me completely hooked. In my mind, it was these very experienced people saying nice things about my work. And that felt really, really nice. So I was hooked and I wanted to keep doing it. So I ported my other filters one by one. They integrated them into the GIMP source code. And I started building a web page, which was hosted at my university. And part of it was dedicated to providing a list of the people who were contributing to the development of the GIMP. This was 1995 or 96. So if you remember the sorts of web pages that people used to make back then, they were called home pages. Everybody wanted to have a flashy title or logo for their web page with these very garish textures. And the GIMP was perfect for doing that. But you need to follow some steps to be able to achieve a garishly colored or textured piece of text. I compiled them in a list. I put it in my webpage, and it sort of became the way for GIMP contributors to get to know each other. At some point, they set up an IRC channel so we could meet there. There was a mailing list. We had all the trappings of a free software projects from the 90s, IRC channel, our mailing lists.
Usenet.
Our FTP site. Yeah, Usenet, our FTP site. I don't remember at what point that thing got onto version control. We were using CVS back then. It was the only thing available. I do remember that the guy that set up a source code repository for GIMP, he was also the admin of the source control system we started using for GNOME back then, and some months afterwards when we started. So I was working on the GIMP. One problem that it had in terms of being fully free software is that the user interface for the GIMP was written using Motif. It was a proprietary GUI toolkit for X11, for the X11 Windows system. The way it worked is that the GIMP's authors, I think because they were from the University of California, they had a license to use Motif. So they could compile the university's Motif license, distribute the binaries, no problem. And the way they made it possible for people without Motif licenses to write plugins for the GIMP was that the core binary for the GIMP, which was the thing they compiled at their university, was responsible for handling the user interface of the plugins. So the plugins were just like a tiny image processing kernel.
I think this is awesome. It may be a bit too in the weeds for most of our listeners. So suffice to say, you got really involved with GIMP, which has a horrible name, and we can all agree with that.
Yeah.
Stuff. If you want to talk about that at length, listeners, I am here. You have my email, richard@sustainosis.org. But you worked at GIMP, you made these awesome plugins, you figured out how to make a website, you started this community of things around it. How did that turn into GNOME?
Sometime afterwards, the GIMP authors were not satisfied with using a proprietary GUI toolkit, so they wrote their own. They wrote a free GUI toolkit called GTK, the GIMP toolkit, and GTK had some nice things. It was one of the first free GUI toolkits back then to actually try really hard to support good visual output, because it was made for a graphics program. So back then, it was really hard to display full color images in the X Windows system for different reasons. One of the reasons was that nobody had 24-bit video cards. We all had 8-bit video cards. So you had to mess around with palettes and color mapping, and it was really messy. But this toolkit made that actually reasonably easy to use. So they rewrote the GIMP using their new and free GUI toolkit. And at some point, people started wanting to write their own software, not related to image processing, but using this GUI toolkit. So together with a couple of people, I split GTK, the GUI toolkit, off of the GIMP source code and made it available as its own standalone thing. So we now had two independent things, GTK on its own as a GUI toolkit that people could use, and the GIMP as just an app, quote unquote, that used GTK. So that was that. Sometime afterwards, I think Miguel was trying to get a job at Microsoft, because Microsoft back then had a team that was porting Internet Explorer to Solaris, of all things. Miguel had a friend that he knew from IRC, so they invited him for an interview or something like that. And from talking to people at Microsoft, Miguel got to learn just how it was that Microsoft could write software at such a big scale so quickly. It turns out that they had this thing called a component architecture, which is where you build software out of little parts that are independent from each other and they just talk to each other.
Yeah.
So back then in the 90s, Internet Explorer was an HTML display component, a GUI graphical Chrome component, an HTTP component, a blah, blah, blah component. And they just plug these things together to get a web browser.
You build a lot of small things and they all do one thing well, and you plug them all together.
Yeah, although it's kind of architecturally different because it's like just a single direction, pipelines that go in a single direction, whereas Microsoft component architecture was multi-directional, blah, 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 blah.
Okay, cool.
When Miguel came back to Mexico from his trip, he told me, hey, we don't have this for Unix or for free software at all. We don't have a way to write sophisticated components and ship them and make it able that let people write software by plugging them together. So we need to get on this. So we started researching how to do that. We found some software from Xerox that let you do the basic communications framework for doing this kind of stuff. And at that point, while we were in the middle of researching that, the KDE project got announced. KDE started as a graphical desktop environment for free systems done as free software. It looked very much like Windows 95 because Windows 95 was new and cool and amazing. And when we saw it, it was beautiful. Back then, if you looked at the sort of user interface that Unix or Linux systems had, it was horrible, man. There was no consistency whatsoever in the user interfaces. Every program had its own GUI toolkit, its own way of configuring the printer, its own way of configuring everything. Nothing talked to each other. Own way of configuring everything. No programs talked to each other. Back then, there was no plug and play for anything. Nothing worked out of the box. You had to build your software environment out of disparate parts. And it was really, really, really hard to get things going. So KDE came along and it was beautiful. It had a single common way of letting applications write out their configuration files, display stuff to the screen, present menu bars, define shortcuts for the menu commands. Everything you expect out of a modern development framework for applications, it had that. And I remember back then, Miguel had a bunch of friends and contacts at Red Hat, for example. When Miguel told his friends at Red Hat, hey, have you people seen this? Like, why don't you ship it for the user interface? And they said, well, we have indeed looked at it, but it has a big problem. One part of the system is not free software. It allows free software to be built on top of it, but that part is not free software. And the part that was not free software was Qt, the Qt toolkit, which is the moral equivalent of GTK, just a box of tools to let you build graphical applications. So we said, it would be really hard to rewrite KDE on top of GTK because the architecture of Qt and GTK are completely different things. So how hard could it be to write a new environment based on GTK? After all, KDE didn't have that much of a head start, we thought. I mean, it had just been out for like a year or so. So we thought, well, let's try writing our own fully free desktop environment using GTK and all the nice tools we've been developing. So we started doing that because we already had a bunch of contacts and developers working on the GIMP. They nominally knew their way around user interfaces and graphical stuff and how to think of how to architect graphical software. They were all very into the grand free software project to make a fully free computing environment. So people said, yeah, let's do this. They started contributing with everything you can think of. Back then, while I was writing bits of GNOME panel, the thing that appeared on the bottom of your screen. You remember how in Windows 95, you had a bar at the bottom of the screen with a start menu. So while I was writing that thing for GNOME using GTK, I remember one of our colleagues writing a program to let you manage your mailing lists and a program to let you set up a printer, different utilities. The point is that people started writing the most random utilities you can think of, but when you put them together, it kind of looked like a desktop environment that lets you configure your desktop background, maybe configure your keyboard or your mouse. It was nice. We had no idea what we were doing.
So Windows 95 came out around 95. So it was
started in 96, I think. And we announced GNOME, the earliest development version, we announced it on August 97. Nothing worked. It was for developers only, but it was a start.
So you've been doing this for almost 3 decades, which is pretty intense. GNOME has gone on to be used by around half of the Linux distributions as the desktop environment. KDE is still around. There are other desktop environments, but those are the main 2, more or less. GNOME has had thousands of contributors over the time. It has a full foundation behind it. It's a 501c3 centered in California. I know that because I was the executive director for the past 10 months. And as of last Saturday, I'm no longer the executive director, but that was a thing, right? And GNOME is still around. And good luck to Stephen. GNOME is awesome and it's huge. It's one of the cornerstones at this point of a quote, successful open source project. You don't get 30 years without having some sorts of successes. And you don't get to hundreds of millions of users, which is probably how many, because there's no tracks. We don't know how many, but at least tens of millions of users.
Yeah, we definitely got lucky in that people liked it and wanted to contribute and distribute it and everything. We had friends in the right places. We knew people at Red Hat. We knew people at Mandrake before it turned into Mandriva. We knew people at different Linux distributions. We knew a bunch of people in the GNU project doing GCC, libc, glibc, all the important infrastructural software that was available back then. It was important to be able to talk as friends or as colleagues to a lot of these people because, we all really had a shared goal, of making a fully free computing environment. And I feel sorry that a lot of spotlight was put onto us, maybe not on KDE at times, but back then the license of Qt was a big problem. And I think if there had not been as much pressure from GNOME, I don't know if Trolltech would have released Qt as a free library years later. So that was a good thing. KDE is amazing. They have done bits like the parallel universe graphical environment. It's great. It works fine. There's really, really good software written for KDE. I love it. I use their applications all the time. And both projects had their offshoots later, from GNOME, we got Mate, we got, XFCE, LXDE, a bunch of smaller desktop environments. But I like to think it as diversity in action. Some environments focus more on being very small, very minimal, being able to work on very small machines or very old machines. Some people focus on other things, and that's fine. It all adds to the diversity in the software ecosystem. So I'm happy the way things turned out.
Earlier, you mentioned that we knew all these people, right? We knew people here, we knew people there. But you started out the conversation by saying, I met this dude in the hallway talking about C++. And you didn't know these people originally. So back in the 90s, and because you've been around so long, you've been working uninterrupted on some type of GNOME for the past 30 years, right? There's no point where you went and worked as a math teacher in a high school or something else.
I tell people that I won the free software lottery. Like, Red Hat offered me a job in 98. They offered me a job pretty soon, and I was at Red Hat for a year and a half. Then my work visa expired and I had to come back to Mexico. So by that time, Miguel and his friend had already founded Helix Code, which later got renamed to Ximian. And that's where we wrote Evolution, the Outlook clone, a bunch of infrastructure for the GNOME desktop, a package updater, a bunch of really pretty stuff. And I'm very thankful that Red Hat started their Red Hat Advanced Development Labs, because it was a tiny part of the company completely dedicated on developing GNOME to turn it into a product and to add the things that were missing to ship a first public version. So I got very lucky there.
I think you got lucky, but also the methods that you used were useful to allow you to sort of develop on that luck. You worked in the open, right? Qt wasn't effectively licensed and your thing was effectively licensed. So it was able to build this groundswell through conscious decisions that led to a strong community, and then through being nice people working towards a shared goal. The shared goal in this case being a free and accessible desktop environment. That's what you wanted to do, and that's largely what you've done with the help of others. It's interesting to me how you keep phrasing it as like we weren't, we knew people and they helped. They're like, this happened and it was amazing and I won the lottery, which minimizes your own involvement, but also the involvement of the tools that you were using. I'm not saying that you're overly humble. I'm saying that the way that you did it allowed this. It afforded it to happen, which of course I'm biased. I'm talking on an open source podcast, but like, it's definitely a thing that I'm thinking about when I'm listening to this great story. When I first asked you, hey, how did you start? I expected like a 1-minute response. This has been a really low level, awesome, hey, here's how it went. And it's been interesting for me to tease out, oh, that's how that happened.
It has been a huge process of finding the missing pieces that we needed at any one point and trying to find people to implement those pieces, or learning how to do it basically ourselves. Sometimes people had to come in from the outside and teach us how to do some things. For example, in the early 2000s, Sun Microsystems came along and taught us how to do usability and the importance of usability, because hackers are not knowledgeable by default on how to make things easy to use for people who are not full-time computer users, who don't devote their lives to the computer. So they taught us usability. They gave us the accessibility infrastructure, which we also had no idea that it was even needed or how to implement that. And at various points in the journey, different people came along, and people like to use this metaphor of a potluck or the stone soup, where everybody brings their own little ingredient to make the big, delicious soup. It was pretty much like that.
One of the questions I have that's running through my mind is what's different about your story from most of the people who I've had on the podcast who've been working in open source for a long time is where it happened. I'm looking at the guest list for Sustain, and we have 2/3 of our guests tend to be American. Majority of them tend to be male. That sucks. I would like to interview more people, and I try hard to find different variety and diverse guests here. We've had 10% of our guests from the Global South. In Mexico, we've had a couple of Mexicans on the podcast, but not a ton. And I'm just curious, how much do you think that weighs into it? Do you think it's been a hindrance? Do you think it's helped? Do you think it's just not relevant because you're just focusing on open source?
In retrospect, I think it's a hindrance in terms of the sorts of ideas that we could have gotten from people on our side of the world. Unfortunately, even nowadays, to be able to develop free software, to be able to participate in the development, if you are not paid to do it, you need gigantic amounts of free time. And the people who have gigantic amounts of free time are usually young students, usually male, because women are quote unquote forced to help more with, housekeeping, that sort of thing, raising children, helping with housework. So you have this series of disadvantages that get put onto people. So the ones that are able to use a lot of time to contribute, it doesn't matter how, it can be code, documentation, graphics, whatever, mostly end up being white male people from the global north, because that's the most privileged stratum of society, I guess. And one thing I didn't realize when I was a teenager or in my early 20s, that was that every time somebody asked me, well, it's great that you are making this software and releasing it for free, as in zero cost, but how do you make money? How do you get paid for this? And let me state this clearly. Before I got offered my first job at Red Hat, I did not look for it. I did not have to submit my resume to interviewers. They offered me a job and they knew they wanted to hire me. And I think they did the interview just for part of the process of hiring someone. But I did not have to beg them to give me a job. And that never happens for anyone. So I'm very aware of the extremely privileged position I'm in since I was 21, 22. I've never had to look for a job in my life. It was offered to me and given to me. So that's extremely strange. Every time they asked me, and how do you make money, or how does your employer make money out of this? Before I got my job, I told them, oh, well, the GNU founding documents very clearly state that you can work as a consultant and offer your services to people who want to use the software. And they were like, okay, I've never heard of any of the software you're talking about, so I wouldn't know if I could consult with you. And later when I worked at Red Hat or Helix Code or Ximian, I told people, well, there's actual products you can buy, and that's what my employer sells. So buy it and use it and give us money. That made a little more sense for people, but they still could not wrap their heads around the whole giving people permission to copy the software and use it without paying. And now, 20-something years later, we are finding out that that is actually a huge problem because nobody wants to pay for the development of the software. So all the free software infrastructure projects end up basically begging people for money because otherwise there will be no one to write it or maintain it. Back then we were just writing it. Nowadays we're mostly maintaining it. So things have definitely changed. We don't have to convince people anymore to use open source software. That battle has been won, but mostly the people who benefited from it are either the ones who are able to put that software as part of the machinery they use to make money, or the people who develop it and charge for that development. And that's a small fraction of the people actually writing free software. You know, people like myself who have jobs developing infrastructural open source are really, really lucky. We tend to have stable or stable-ish jobs depending on where you work. But right now, people writing the apps, not the infrastructure, but the apps, nobody pays for the apps. Nobody wants to pay for the apps. There's no infrastructure for paying for an app. So that's part of the infrastructure we have to put into place nowadays. The infrastructure to let people pay for the software that they actually use on a day-to-day basis. We can talk about that later. You know what I'm talking about.
I know what you're talking about. I would argue we haven't won the battle of use open source because I've seen that battle take place in governments and in civic society where people still fork over to Microsoft or Outlook and don't think about other things because they're like, well, it's not dependable or it has lock-in or that's stupid. Who would I pay? It's like this weird problem where as a society, we haven't totally won that battle. For corporations, obviously I'll take free labor from other people and I'll use their open source tool.
Yeah,
That's much easier. And for militaries as well, like, yeah, sure. Why would we develop that? We could just use the open source version. That's not a problem. Militaries are massive users of open source, but for civic infrastructure, it's still, and for national infrastructure in general. So yeah, Federico, I'm realizing that we spent 40 minutes on this and I would love to chat all day. I feel like
we can move on to maintaining infrastructure if you want, if you have time.
I think we have a bit of time. I'm curious, what do you mean when you say we can move on to maintaining infrastructure?
It's not that we can move on to maintaining infrastructure. It's that we have ended up doing that without actually striving to do that. The software has gotten established, well-known. It's old. Like any old piece of software, it's like maintaining a house, If you don't maintain a house, it will start to get damaged very quickly and at different rates for different parts of its structure. Software doesn't rot, but the environment around it changes and the software stops working when the environment changes. So you constantly have to update the build system here. We'll move on to a different documentation framework there. And now graphics cards want to be programmed as if they were games rather than 2D plotters. And now, users expect to be able to plug and play devices all the time, which we didn't even have before. And now there's multi-touch screens, which there weren't before. So software needs to be maintained, adapted, upgraded, discarded. There's going to come a time when you will have to think about decommissioning your software because it got obsolete and nobody wants to update it, maintain it anymore. Sometimes you have an available replacement. Sometimes you don't. Sometimes you need to do massive amounts of work to move to a replacement because it's not exactly plug and play. So you need to do work to be able to use it, that sort of thing. And we have ended up doing that by default. We are trying to move the way applications get distributed and executed in desktop computers or laptops in the same way that they do in phones or tablets, which are sandboxed, isolated, very secure. People have the freedom to download them and have the confidence that it will not steal your data, crash the rest of your machine, corrupt your system installation, blah, 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 blah. So we have to move all the applications to doing that. And there's always that sort of work that becomes available or necessary. Just this week, I learned that the maintainer of an important piece of infrastructure, he's retiring from maintaining his piece. And it's a very low level, very abstract thing. So I don't want to take up the time to explain what it is. It's a piece of basic infrastructure, widely used, and he's just moving on. There's nobody available to keep maintaining it. There's going to be security issues in the future because it's at the level of the infrastructure where the security bugs happen. Yeah. So that's important to keep an eye on. And I'm starting this little project to see if we can replace it with something else. I have an idea of some things we can use, where it needs to be replaced, some idea of places where it can be substituted for something else entirely. Like we're not switching cars from one car maker to another. We're switching to bicycles or a different thing that still lets you move from one place to another. So yeah, that sort of work needs to be done all the time.
That sounds fundable to me. Hey, the entire system's going to crash.
It is very fundable. I think it has happened in the past for other critical pieces of infrastructure. But yeah, that's definitely fundable.
So I know that there have been maintainers who have intentionally sabotaged their software to say, I need money. That happened a few years ago with Faker.js.
Oh, yeah.
I'm curious. Heartbleed wasn't that, right? That was just a bug at a low-level part of the authentication software, security software that broke and someone needed to fix it. I wonder, do you think it's better to let those things rot to the point where the bridge falls and then get funding for it? Do you think it's better to fix it first?
I think it's better to fix it first in general. Although over the years, I've learned a lot about doing maintenance of old systems, learning about an old system to be able to work on it. Because often the internals of software are not well documented or They have a lot of hidden assumptions. So it takes a lot of work and skill to be able to recover that context, that knowledge from the source code, the existing documentation, old posts in mailing lists, commit messages in the source code repository. So recovering that lost context becomes very useful when you're trying to evolve the thing, keep on developing it. And one of the things I've learned through that process is to think about whether you want to maintain a piece of infrastructural software indefinitely, or rather think about, is this really needed anymore? Are there parts of that software that are not needed anymore and parts that are? Can we remove the old parts, deprecate them, mark them as do not use this part, but keep using the good part instead? And for different technical and social reasons, sometimes it's possible to do that, sometimes it's not. What can you remove? What can you safely upgrade? What can you not really modify the functionality because people expect a certain way of working, but rather change the internals so that it affords being changed or upgraded later? In 2016, I became the maintainer of another infrastructure library that had gone unmaintained for a while. It's called LibreSVG. It takes care of rendering SVG images to pixels. It didn't have a maintainer. It had a couple of security bugs, of outstanding security bugs. So they asked me, the GNOME people asked me, hey, would you take a look? And I said, yes. And I ended up maintaining the thing. And then I started to learn the Rust programming language, which is this new and fancy programming language for exactly the sort of infrastructure software I tend to work on. Let's say old school infrastructural software used to be written in C and C++. They had very particular technical properties to make that necessary. And nowadays, higher level software, the software that sits on top of that infrastructure is written in whatever, C#, Java, Python, Ruby, all the nice high level languages that we know about, right? But this software that sits in the basement has not gotten upgraded to anything newer because there wasn't anything that could replace C or C++. So maybe 10 years ago, there was the first release of the Rust programming language and ecosystem.
Yep.
Right in Rust, it was explicitly designed to be able to replace C and C++ at that level of the infrastructure stack. So together with some people, we ported LibreSVG from C to Rust. We didn't rewrite it. We ported it basically line by line, And one of the killer features that Rust has is that it allows you to do that. So there was maybe 3 years during which half of LibreSVG was written in C and half was written in Rust, the code that we had already ported. And the users of that library, they never noticed that. It was not visible to them that this whole thing was being rewritten line by line under the covers. So we succeeded in doing that. And that taught me a lot of things about what sort of software we can slowly replace with newer, better things. It's not just making PC work for the sake of keeping getting paid as a maintainer. It's also part of evolving the thing. Now, Rust allows for nicer software architecture. It's easier to write automated tests. The whole process of developing it becomes so much nicer. So it's also a way of bringing new people in. And I like that.
This podcast is part of the Maintainer Month podcast series. So May is Maintainer Month. That's a global thing. GitHub has thrown in $1,000 to help out with funding the podcast, which is nice. Thank you for that. And if you missed it, there was a podcast which we just had by Dirk-Jan Ochtman. And Dirk-Jan has gone around and rewritten a lot of low-level things in Rust. That's basically what he does. One of these people who's going out and fixing these things. And so I love that there are people out there, the champions of infrastructure, who are thinking about, hey, how do we make this successful for the next generation? How do we stop the graying of open source? How do we rewrite all the things in Rust? Federico, I could talk to you forever. You have so much experience, and there's so many things I wish we could have gotten to. How to build code of conduct, what the function of a 501c3 is. I still don't really know, but I'm very excited and just grateful that we had this conversation. And it was good to spend the time. You have a blog, which is part of GNOME Planet. Is that the main place where people can follow you online? Are there places besides Mastodon where you exist?
I post a lot in Mastodon. I mostly just retweet people there. My blog is at viruta.org. I post my technical blog posts there. That's where you can see the whole story about how we ported LibRSVG to Rust, the stuff I've been doing to upgrade the accessibility documentation and the communications infrastructure there. I'm going to embark on another project to help the GNOME calendar people with their automated tests. So that's going to be there. There's good stuff there.
That's viruta.org, viruta.org. Federico, again, this was amazing. I really appreciated it. Don't leave yet. At the end of every podcast, we have Spotlight. Spotlight is the part of the podcast where we highlight or showcase or just put some light on other people or things. My Spotlight today is going to be 1491. This is an audiobook I have been listening to recently. I'm not just saying it because Federico is obviously Mexican, and I feel like I should learn more about Mexico, but because it's just a really good book. And the audiobook's actually quite nice. I'll link to the Wikipedia article, and it's about the indigenous populations of the Americas before Western people totally messed it up. One of my favorite things about reading this book was realizing that my ancestors, who, for better or worse, were genocidal, awful people, colonized Massachusetts, and they wouldn't be alive today if the indigenous hadn't given them corn. So 1491 has helped me appreciate that even more. Super, super sweet book. It's written by Charles C. Mann. It came out in 2005, but still very good reading.
I've heard very good things about that book on a related topic. If you want to follow up with more or less that story, there's this fantastic book called Malintzin. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Malintzin. She was the native interpreter that Hernán Cortés used when he was doing the conquest of Mexico for the Spaniards. There's a lot of debates in Mexico about whether Malintzin was a traitor or not. It turns out that she was just a woman that was given to the conquering soldiers as not a gift, but as a token of respect, because that was a custom back then for Mexican, Mesoamerican cultures. And she was not, let's say, part of Moctezuma's kingdom, the ruler of what was then Mexico City, the great Tenochtitlan. So no, she was not a traitor. She was doing whatever she could to survive. And turns out that she was good at learning languages. She spoke Maya. She spoke Nahuatl, which was a language spoken in central Mexico. And she learned Spanish for very interesting reasons, because there was already a Spanish guy who was living as a castaway in Mayan lands. So he spoke Spanish. Malintzin spoke Mayan, so he learned Spanish from this guy. And that's how she was able to speak with Cortés and his soldiers. So it's a great historical book. It's written part as a novel and part as actual history. It's by Camilla Townsend, an anthropologist from the United States, I think. And the writing is just fantastic.
I'm dropping the archive.org link so anyone can read that for free online. Thank you, archive.org. And that'll be in the show notes. Federico, is that your spotlight? Do you want another one?
I just finished reading Percival Everett's James. Did you ever read Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain?
Yeah, of course.
You remember Jim, the enslaved guy who took the brunt of Huck and Tom Sawyer's jokes. This is that story written from the viewpoint of Jim. He's an enslaved black person who is trying to either escape to freedom while taking his family along with him. And it's about that written in the universe of Mark Twain. And it's just an incredibly good and deep book. It's one of the best books I've ever read. For real. It's amazing.
That's Percival Everett's James. It won the 2024 Kirkus Prize, the National Book Award, and the Pulitzer. So it has won some awards if you need other people to tell you. But Federico, thank you for bringing that out. I do need to read that. I think they made a graphic novel of it as well, which you could also go check out.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. And Taika Waititi was apparently in talks. He may still be in talks. I don't know. To do a novelization, a film novelization, which would be amazing because CycloDB
Holy
is awesome.
crap. Yeah, that would be great.
Federico, thank you so much for coming on. Listeners, I hope you've enjoyed this podcast. I know it has been a bit longer than normal and a bit more low level, but that's exciting and cool because we do and should talk about low level code on this podcast at times. If you liked it, there are several things you can do. I already mentioned that GitHub has sponsored the Maintainer Month of May podcast. Your company could also sponsor them. Go to opencollective.com/sustainoss and please donate. If you can't and you prefer to talk to someone who could pitch it better, email me at richard@sustainoss.org. Tell your friends about this podcast. Invite them all to listen. Invite them all to share it. Go to the podcast show notes at podcast.sustainoss.org to see the links that were mentioned here. Go read the awesome books. You can find us as well on Mastodon and Blue Sky and LinkedIn and wherever Sustain products are sold. We don't really sell any products. We just sort of give away the podcast for free. Thank you, Federico. You can find him on GNOME. That's gnome.org. GNOME with a G. Federico, muchas gracias por todos. It's super awesome to have you on today. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.